Chancellor Mukherjee, Vice Chancellor Mehta, Ambassador Rao, founders, faculty, staff members without whom nothing gets done, I know that, proud parents, and most of all, dear students, this is your day. I have to say I'm truly honored to have been invited to deliver the convocation address to the 2018 graduating class of Ashoka. I guess you're the first class that spent the 4 years here on the new campus. It's absolutely astonishing. Just astonishing. I truly thank all of you who were responsible for bestowing the singular distinction on me. I count myself very fortunate indeed to have been associated with Ashoka for a number of years, though usually and unfortunately from a distance in New York. It was in the spring of 2013 that I was invited to meet in New York with Pramat Raj Sinha when Ashoka was being created as India's first fully fledged liberal arts college with the global range and conceptual inventiveness and flexible syllabi that characterized the best such colleges in the world. The general framework was still under construction then, but I could see how special Ashoka was to become. And in fact, it's now truly the model for India, and I have to say, as someone who's traveled from China to Paris, from London to New York to Berkeley, Ashoka is the most exciting college in the world at the moment. As I was saying, when we first met, the founders and I, the general framework was still under construction, but I could see how special the college and university were going to become when they warmly accepted my suggestion that the curriculum should include, along with a lot of Kant and Shakespeare, just a little Kalidas and Shakuntala. And it was another memorable moment for me to be invited to speak in New Delhi before the Young India Fellows at the first crossover lecture series in September of 2013. Now, all these previous and precious experiences, to say nothing of the very name of this wonderful institution, naturally led me to suppose that this event for me would be Ashoka. There would be no grief in preparing this presentation, but in fact, it hasn't turned out that way for me. When you are a scholar of my age, you're likely to have delivered lectures across your own country, maybe even across the world, and you're typically invited to speak because you have some useful knowledge in a particular field. A convocation address is something very different. By definition, you're supposed to distill a lifetime's worth of knowledge for students who have completed their formal education, to offer some words of advice as they begin their careers. But really, I began to ask myself, when I sat down to write this, what wisdom do I have to share with you? What guidance could I possibly give you? So I looked at my own life, and that doesn't really suggest many general lessons, I have to say. Especially if I think back when I was sitting in your chair, when I was just graduating from college. I just happened to be a person completely mad about classical languages, besotted with class. And in fact, I didn't give a faintest thought, maybe it was the time, 1968. I didn't give the slightest moment's thought to what I was going to do when I got out of college. It was only when one day, just a few months before graduation, that a professor approached me and he asked if I'd ever considered graduate school. And you will be astonished to learn, since I know everybody has started preparing their biodata at 5 years old, that I didn't even know what graduate school was. And then he said to me, this is what I interpreted him as saying, "You will get paid for reading Sanskrit poetry." I said, "Count me in." So I guess follow your passion. That's what they all say. Follow your passion. I suppose that's one conclusion you could draw from my life. That's totally banal, but it's totally true. At some point in your life, you must do what you really love. Another, show up. Just show up. 80% of success in life is showing up. Develop a thick skin. You're going to need it. If you have a position in the world, you will get hammered. A thick skin and the courage of your convictions. But I can't really recommend my career planning, which was basically wait around cluelessly until something good happens, and then hope to be paid for it. But more seriously now, look, someone of my age, I'm supposed to advise people your age going out into a world almost completely unfamiliar to me. I suspect that during this month and next month, across the world, people with gray beards like mine are going to stand up in front of people like you and confess their inability to say anything helpful to you about the challenges you're going to face. And I think this is rightly the case, because those challenges are none that we have ever faced. And I'm not speaking about the growing presence of governments across the world that are posing a truly frightening challenge to the democratic order. That's happened before. Governments come and go. Or the vast technological changes that make even the cognitive capacities of young people, in a sense, born digital as you are, so different from my own. But the world has experienced even greater technological changes, like writing, a huge cognitive transformation, far greater than what we're experiencing today. Or the scourge of gender discrimination and more broadly, social inequality across the world. No, the first of the challenges you're going to face is the mother of all challenges, climate change. Now, this is not the most uplifting thing to talk about on an occasion like this, and it's like contemplating your own mortality. But you know, the Buddhists, they had this maranasmati, this meditation on your own mortality as part of the way to live a full life. Anyway, this is something you've not, of course, never heard before, again and again, that perhaps the most vulnerable area of the world to come is South Asia, with new records of extreme heat, monsoons ever more unpredictable than in the past, water scarcity beyond what's ever been experienced, pollution worse than anything known to date, sea level rises that, when you're my age, 50 years from now, will make Calcutta and Mumbai and New York uninhabitable. Now, if India is among the nations in the world most at risk from these and other potentially catastrophic events that will unfold in your lifetimes, while still struggling with older, stubborn problems of gender and caste inequality, India is also the nation with some of the most remarkable resources available to address these problems. By resources, I don't mean material things like natural resources. I mean the resources of intelligence found in cultural, social, and political traditions. I have been privileged to live my life studying these traditions, and I've become absolutely convinced of their uniqueness and importance for the world at large. These happily provide me with the inspiration for my address, which my own personal life couldn't provide. What can these traditions mean to you as you go out in the world? I know today you're thinking about your future, and that's what you should be thinking about, but our futures are shaped in part by our pasts, and shaped for the better we understand those pasts. And let me tell you how I understand the India past. You are heirs to a tradition of respect for knowledge, rational, systematized, theorized knowledge whose unbroken history of discovery and transmission is without parallel in the annals of the world. Just consider the three shastras that form the basis of education before the modern period. The classical Vyutpati, as it was called. The sciences of words, sentences, and reasons, grammar, hermeneutics, and logic. These sciences, one of the glories of India, penetrate into some of the most fundamental aspects of human being, the use of language, the making texts out of language, and systematic reasoning. No one in human history has penetrated more deeply, seen more clearly into the heart of these sciences than Indians. The inheritors of these insights will solve problems that no one else can solve. You are the heirs of a tradition of literature that has no parallel in its combination of longevity, continuity, and linguistic variety. Just consider for a moment the loving care with which your forebears preserved, under conditions of the most hostile environmental hazard, 3,000 years of literary creativity in 24 languages. Just as Indians were once the cloth makers to the world, so they were the storytellers to the world. Indian tales traveled everywhere. And the wisdom of these storytellers and poets is unlike any other wisdom. It offers the capacity to envision possibilities that may not actually exist in the world we inhabit today, but which we may well need for the world we're going to inhabit. They give us access to radically different forms of human consciousness. They extend the range of possibility of what it has meant and what it could mean to be a human being. The inheritors of this intelligence will be able to imagine solutions no one else can imagine. You are the heirs of a political intelligence that has produced the world's largest democracy, as Ambassador Al just discussed. It is ridiculous to assert, as some have asserted, and here's a quotation which you can forget as soon as I tell you, few scholars dare to acknowledge that for all the problems, British rule did in fact make India's modern democracy, blah, blah, blah. Such an assertion could only be made because of our inability to get clear on the pre-colonial roots of the political ideas that eventually took shape in today's Indian parliamentary democracy. Think of the basic modesty of the old India political order and the constraints on its impact on the social order. Think of the practice of nested or layered local sovereignties, and contrast that for a moment with the centralization of rule you see from Rome to China. Contrast, too, their expansionism with the limited, bounded vision of the Indian polity. And think, lastly, of that extraordinary document of the namesake of this institution, since you have one of the great world authorities in Professor Lahiri. I'm sure you've heard this before. A document where the first time in human history a ruling king apologized for the death of innocents. Where has this ever happened before? So astyanushocanam devanam priyasya vijiniti kalingani. Now, beloved of the gods, feels deep remorse for having conquered the Kalinga people. You are heirs of a tradition of toleration, and I would say unequivocally freedom, which for centuries enabled India to successfully avoid many of the forms of oppression encountered across the world. Of course, there was ideological contestation. Of course, there was violence. But think comparatively just for a minute. It's hard to perceive any restrictions on Indian thought or speech. Censorship was never an Indian value. It's hard to perceive any kind of religious discrimination, certainly not the kind that punished heresy through excommunication. On the contrary, think of the unparalleled ease with which oppressed voices could produce their own new scriptures. Cultural discrimination was largely unknown. Linguistic diversity, for example, was never considered a sin to be expiated, as in the founding Western myth of Babel. Local cultural ways were never suppressed. Just think the way the Romans suppressed every language that they came in contact to, or the way the British suppressed Irish, or the Germans suppressed Polish, or the French revolutionaries wanted to annihilate, that was their term, all local languages. Cultural expansion in India, whether empowered by Sanskrit or Persian models of culture, never sought to supplant regional ways. On the contrary, it ennobled those regional ways and enabled them to achieve literary and other kinds of expression for the first time. Perhaps most important, you are heirs of a tradition of constant, relentless, unrestricted, boundless, and brilliant questioning. Nothing in the world of culture, society, politics, or religion, no cultural or social or political assumption, no religious text, however cherished, no belief, however devoutly held, ever escaped questioning in the Indian past. This is true even with respect to the one single most serious blot on Indian life, what a brilliant social theorist called the egregiously obscene forms of inequality. While slow to give way, this shadow of inequality is lifting, thanks precisely to generations of critical insiders, from the early Buddhists to B.R. Ambedkar, who understood that you had to go through the ideology of inequality by study, by critical engagement, by analysis, and not try to go around it through mere legislation, let alone violence, if you hope to overcome it. Your inheritance of these traditions of critical inquiry, of toleration, of political autonomy, of literary wisdom, of analytical knowledge, they may not have been transmitted to you in any direct, unmediated fashion. You may have not had much opportunity or even desire to actively study the traditions in classical Tamil, Persian, Sanskrit, Hindi, whatever. But these traditions are somehow in you, in however mediated a fashion. I can't do better here than quote the great African-American novelist James Baldwin when he said, "We carry history within us. We are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do. It could scarcely be otherwise, since it is to history that we owe our frame of reference, our identities, and our aspirations." This extraordinary Indian past empowers you with the values crucial to addressing the problems you are going to encounter when you leave Ashoka University. And these values, to reduce them to their simplest terms, are diversity, 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 and openness, openness, openness. Now, there are some today who reject this diversity and openness of tradition, who deny even the right to people like me, as supposed outsiders, to tell such a story of India's past. They reserve that right for themselves and seek to produce an image of India's past as one of homogeneity and closure, where inequality was a social benefit, Indianness a restricted category, where outsiders remained outside no matter how long they lived in India, though of course we're all outsiders, we're all immigrants. And no matter what knowledge these people may have offered and received. And they have insisted that the right to tell this story of the past be restricted to those who are the same as them. They have narrowed the options of discussion to conformity or condemnation. And the problem is acute even more so in the India diaspora, where thought police proliferate on social media, hounding those with differing points of view in the name of a tradition that no one in the past would ever have recognized as such. Now, they might say their views are true. And let me just move for a very short moment to a sort of philosophical digression. They may say their views are true, and I would say, however, that that is not a truth that India can live with. And what do I mean by this? What I mean is that we need to consider complementing our historical truths, which is what I've tried to offer in my brief remarks, by the social hope that makes life possible. An American philosopher has explained better than I could the idea of a truth that gives social hope. He once said he didn't believe that there's a way things really are. You can't really get to the past. And instead, he wanted to replace that reality-appearance distinction by one between its descriptions of the world and of ourselves, which are less useful and more useful. It's very much like this great 9th century Rashtrakuta king in his wonderful book, Prashnottara Ratnamalika, the precious garland of questions and answers. He says, Kin Satyam, what is truth? Bhuta Hitam, it's what's good for people. It's rather like that. It's an anticipation of that. So the American philosopher, when pressed to explain, useful for what? The American philosopher responded that he had nothing to say except useful to create a better future. But better by what criterion, he was then asked. And he could only say something like, better in the sense of containing more of what we consider good and less of what we consider bad. And when he was then asked yet again, and what do you exactly consider good? He said he could only reply by citing the great American poet Walt Whitman, the greatest lessons of nature through the universe are the lessons of variety and freedom. Now, I would like to temper this account of truth, it was actually the one offered by the late philosopher Richard Rorty, by suggesting that at a time when science is attacked, when science is needed most, we must preserve the appearance-reality distinction. We must try to discover the way things really are or were. We must honor the truth of the Indian historical traditions. But even as we do so, we have to ask what parts of this truth will ensure ever greater variety to our fellow human beings and their freedom, permitting them as much space to pursue their concerns as is compatible with granting an equal amount to everyone. There is no contradiction between these two aspirations. You, the new graduates of Ashoka University, represent the best of the variety and freedom that India has always celebrated in the past, and the best of what it can be in the future. You are heirs of a great culture, self-confident enough to know that the past, like every past, has produced both civilization and barbarism, and that we can nourish ourselves with the one and overcome the other once we acknowledge it for what it is. You have received an education that embodies precisely that variety and freedom. I feel certain that you will do great things, whatever your calling, to ensure that India has a future marked by critical inquiry, political wisdom, tolerance, imagination of the vast possibilities of human being, and relentless questioning. Believe in yourselves. Believe you can be the change that will make India once again the global leader in healing society and healing the planet. Thank you very much.